Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Dr. Adrian Soto-Mota is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out episode 138 of Boundless Body Radio, which was part of a special series we did featuring Dr. Nick Norwitz as the guest host. We also hosted Dr. Soto-Mota on episode 340 titled The Lipid Energy Model with Dr. Adrian Soto-Mota. Dr. Soto-Mota is an MD, Ph.D. and specialist in internal medicine, and as a data science researcher at the Unidad de Investigación de Enfermedades Metabólicas. Dr. Soto-Mota is passionate about studying low-carbohydrate and ketogenic diets and how they impact human metabolism. Dr. Soto-Mota earned his MD from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and earned his Ph.D. at Oxford. He has created many resources to help people successfully implement a low-carbohydrate diet and provides that help for both English and Spanish-speaking individuals. He is the co-author of a 2022 paper titled The Lipid Energy Model, Reimagining Lipoprotein Function in the Context of Carbohydrate-Restricted Diets, which was also co-authored by a former guest, Dr. Norwitz and Dave Feldman, who were both hosted in episode 109 of our show. Dr. Adrian Soto-Mota, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you again. Thank you. Thanks, Casey. I love your podcast, and I'm very grateful to be here again.
Well, I'm very grateful that you're here. I told you off air that I absolutely love your work. I love chatting with you. I always learn something new. You're always out doing so much. You're so busy and learning amazing new things that now we're ready to share some of those learnings and hopefully advance the field in so many different things and different ways. So I really appreciate that. I have to tell you that I took a trip to Mexico not too long ago, and I decided like this country is so beautiful. The people are wonderful and they're amazing. And I already speak Portuguese. So why don't I learn Spanish? I'm going to pull up Duolingo every single day in just 5 minutes. Simple habit. Let's start small. I'm going to go home and that first day we'll do it. It's been about a year and a half and I have opened Duolingo exactly 0 times. And so I apologize if any Spanish I said in the introduction sounded a little bit like Portuguese.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was more than understandable and accurate. And I mean, next time you're in Mexico, do let me know.
Yeah, I will for sure. I absolutely will. I would love to go check out the Grand Prix down there. Actually, the Mexico City Grand Prix would be an amazing race to watch. I'll go check that out and give me a call when I'm there.
To be honest, I've never been there, but everyone, I mean, all my friends who have say it's quite a show. So yeah, feel free to just drop a message if you are attending that.
Yeah, that's awesome. The track is really unique because there's actually a stadium that the track kind of passes under. And there's a lot of obviously like really excited Formula One fans around the world. I have never heard the crowd at any race go as bananas as when Checo makes the corner and passes under the stadium. The place goes nuts. It's awesome.
Yes,
awesome.
Yes. Mexican crowds tend to be loud.
That's great.
Crazy to say the least.
That's great. One thing I learned about you that I actually didn't know, you've been hit by a bus, literally hit by a bus. What was that like?
Yeah, that's, fortunately, in the midst or within an unfortunate event, I was riding an Uber and the bus crashed my Uber from the rear, and yeah, I did have a cervical fracture, a compression fracture, C5 and C6, and I had to wear a rigid brace for half a year and do lots of rehab, but in the end, it turned out well, and I did lose some of the mobility because of that. But you know, I mean, it could have been so much worse.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I had the worst part of that particular car crash because of the location I was in the car.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's I mean, fortunately, to be honest, I have almost no sequels. I mean, it's just there are just particular situations or angles where I need to move my whole torso to do. But besides that, it's
I think it's just going to be one of those things that our mutual friend, Dr. Nick Norwitz, is never going to let you forget about. I think he's always going to reach out.
Sure. We were in the midst of submitting a paper, and I mean, I was good enough. My hands were working. I just had a weird neck. But yeah. It's one of those stories Nick will never let me forget.
Definitely. Well, you grew up in a very smart household. I believe your dad was a doctor, your mom was into philosophy. And when I go back and listen to some of our last interviews, there's just a different way that you talk. And it reminds me a lot of my kind of practice into stoicism. And there's a way of like identifying things without getting too wrapped up or getting too personal in things that it has been really helpful in my life. And I'm just wondering, what was it like to grow up in a house where philosophy was, I'm assuming, talked about and practiced quite a bit? And how has that affected your work today when you're looking at science and really complex studies?
I mean, it's hard to tell a difference because, as you say, it's the environment I was raised in. And in other words, I don't have much of a point of comparison, because it really shaped the way my brain is wired in a way. For example, my dad, he's not a doctor. Not a medical doctor. He's a mathematician. And from him, I got my love for statistics and physics. And I like this because since I was little, I tend to see science as, philosophy of nature. And actually, for example, if you go and see Isaac Newton's degree, it was doctor in nature's philosophy. And in a way, the way I see philosophy is, like the organized juxtaposition of ideas. And these ideas can sometimes be experiments. These ideas can be semantical. These ideas can be logical derivations of a particular statement. These ideas sometimes have to do something with causality, and these ideas have sometimes something to do with, I don't know, human behavior, religion, how the world works. So to me, because my father, even when he didn't have, like formal training in philosophy until later in his life, we were always, my brother and I, we were always expected to make an extra effort in explaining our train of thought and to explore or to reflect and to think about why we were feeling a certain way, why we were thinking a certain way. Something I remember also frequently is that, and I incorporate this in my daily life, is what would you have to see to change your conclusion? If you saw what kind of evidence, you would change your mind about it. And for example, I think that's incredibly useful in science because I mean, you would expect that scientists would be open-minded people who are willing to change their minds. But in reality, it's really not like that. Our human nature and our human biases make it difficult for scientists particularly who have vested at least some of their identity to a particular idea, to change their mind on that particular idea. I mean, that's just human behavior, and that's expected. That's why I think it's always useful to think and to analyze, how does the evidence that would make me change my mind look like? Because I think this is helpful for designing experiments. This is helpful for solving interpersonal issues, for learning about yourself and about others. And I mean, even to this day, and my relationship with my brother and with my parents has definitely those accents. It's filled with contrasting ideas, contrasting arguments. Our banter tends to focus on that was a poor argument, like, and to be honest, I don't know a different situation for growing up, because of course I grew up in only family in my case. So it definitely shaped how I see the world. It definitely shaped how I do what I do. I'm not saying everyone should do the same, at the same time, I think that there's a variety of different family environments or social environments with pros and cons. And I mean, the con in our case is that we tend to overthink pretty much everything,
Yeah.
And we are capable of having a 20-minute heated debate on what particular cut of meat you want to have for dinner, and that's not efficient many times. And I think there's definitely not a perfect upbringing environment, but it definitely shaped who I am. It gave me some useful skills I am grateful for today. And one of the things that I would highlight is that it made me feel comfortable with the idea of changing.
Yeah.
I mean, as we talked before, I learned when I was in med school that diabetes is something that you can never reverse or cure, that metformin is only for patients with perfect kidney function, that you should never prescribe metformin to people with type 1 diabetes, that you absolutely needed carbs to thrive. I mean, I was taught so many things that I don't believe today. And it was useful to be able to change my mind, that gave me the capacity to unlearn and learn again, which of course I think it's something essential in our in particular in my field of practice.
Yeah.
Can I make a 2-minute pause here?
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, so for me, that is a very nice barometer of knowing who the people I should be following is. Like the people I've learned that say things very carefully, very deliberately, they define things really well. And then they also say, well, this isn't the question we were asking with this particular study, or they say, we don't know, or we think that this is our idea, this is our hypothesis, versus I hear other people and they say like, well, everybody knows that, whatever the sentence is. Everybody knows that you should have more fruits and vegetables. Experts agree that you should have more fruits and vegetables, things like that. And then you never really get to like, well, who said who? How, when, or where was that proven? And yeah, again, it's really nice to be able to help me understand who the people I should be following, and who are the people asking the right questions, and who can maybe get us at least closer to the answers. And this is where I think it's really helpful that people like Dave Feldman, like we mentioned in the introduction, we talked about heavily in the last episode that we did in episode 340. Dave explains that since he came from a data science background, more engineering, it's the expectation that you are destroying things that you've already made. You are supposed to. In fact, the oldest ideas are the ones that need to be destroyed the most. And so, when he came into the health field and started asking questions from that mindset, he's never in love with his ideas. In fact, he's always constantly trying to prove himself wrong to learn something new. So again, we talked about this in episode 340, but I don't think we can talk about your more recent work without reminding us how that all came about. Can you share Dave's story, what he learned, and how you got involved with all of his work that he's doing with cholesterol?
Sure. Dave was the first who very, sharply noticed that it is those who are lean and restrict carbohydrates, the ones who have super high LDL changes in their blood. Because by then there were already some studies involving different, degrees of carbohydrate restriction in different populations and for different medical purposes. And some of them were observing an LDL rise, some of them observed LDL basically not changing at all, some of them observing reductions. So it was not clear what made LDL change and in which direction. And Dave proposed that it was lean people. It was lean people who, because they are lean, they have a more strained lipid oxidation demand when they have carbohydrate restriction. And that in order, the hypothesis he put forward was that in order to adapt to that particular demand, lipoprotein metabolism changed differently in lean people versus in people living with overweight. And the first time I heard about Dave was listening to an episode from Peter Attia. And he described the experiments he used to do with white bread. And I had to see that for myself. I did it on myself. I saw that because I was lean and I was already used to restricting some carbohydrates. So I said, I need to see this if this happens on me as well. And then what I found was that yes, exactly what he described in himself and others was happening to me as well. And then I started changing my mind. This is conflicting evidence to what I would expect from what I learned in med school. Because at the same time back then, I used to think, because that's what I learned, saturated fat would make your LDL go up. And I simply attributed those LDL changes to more saturated fat, but then I restricted that and still observed the LDL changes going up. So again, I tested myself against what someone else was saying. And I think that's how I got involved in that. Later on, when I knew about Dave way before he knew about me, Nick invited me to a data analysis project that he had with Dave. And that's how the LMHR paper came about. That was published almost exactly 1 year ago in Current Developments in Nutrition. And in that particular study, we analyzed data from people saying, I have the same, this was my BMI when I started low carb, this was my lipid panel, this was my lipid panel after I adhered to the low carbohydrate diet. And then because of that, we mentioned, we put forward in a more formal way, you could say, a paper summarizing the existing evidence and the testable hypothesis of the lipid energy model. So you would expect that if you induce carbohydrate restriction, you would see this spectrum of LDL changes. Those who are lean should have LDL elevations, those who are obese should have LDL reductions, and then the middle, and then everything in the middle. And that this should be altered by energy demand, either exercise or the degree of carbohydrates you are having. That's how I became involved in the LMHR phenotype and the lipid energy model. I saw it, work on myself. By then I already knew because I already sequenced myself. So I did whole genome sequencing years ago. And I knew I don't have familial hypercholesterolemia. I don't have any of the genotypes associated with higher LDL. That's what convinced me that it wasn't just, keto is harmful for people with high LDL predisposition, genetic predisposition. And that was it. That's how I became involved in that. Because of that paper, because the senior author in the LMHR paper is Professor David Ludwig. And that's how I got in touch with David. Actually, I got in touch with David many, many years before. When I was looking for a PhD program, I considered Harvard and Oxford. And I wrote to David Ludwig, but he didn't have space in his lab back then. And at the same time, Oxford already accepted me, so I went to Oxford. And in the end, I ended up working with David Ludwig as well a few years later. David invited me to analyze the publicly available data from DietVids, which is this last paper that was published. It's actually, we still don't know if it will be in the February or March issue of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, but it's already ahead of print online available. It's open access. And David invited me to analyze data from diet feeds because these could shed some insights on a different kind of model, the carbohydrate insulin model, which in contrast to the most prevalent paradigm of obesity, states that weight changes are the result of a surplus or deficit of calories. In contrast, the carbohydrate insulin model states that weight changes are a consequence of the hormonal response to different foods, in particular to glycemic load. The small parenthesis there, glycemic load is how much your glucose changes in your blood times how much of those foods you ate. So the glycemic index is how much a standard amount of food raises your blood when you eat it. The glycemic load is glycemic index times the portion size you have that particular food. And the carbohydrate insulin model proposes that, well, it is glycemic index stimulating insulin secretion, what makes it harder or easier to eat more, which brings weight changes in either direction, up or down. So that's how I became involved with those two models and basically analyzing data for both of them. And I think now that I think about it, it's fun to say that both models are opposite to what I used to think when I left med school, And I think that it is also likely that the lipid energy model and the carbohydrate insulin model are surely approximations to the natural philosophical truth of the underlying mechanisms of human physiology. It's likely there is this famous phrase in data analysis that all models are wrong, but they are useful. It's not that every single prediction of the lipid energy model will be met to the millimeter, and every single prediction of the carbohydrate insulin model will be correct. And both models are a statement in a multifactorial set of correlated mechanisms. It's just that they can approximate us better to the interventions that are more likely to influence a positive change in someone's life. So it's not really about which model wins the race or which model turns out to be more correct or correct. It's really more about, let's understand this better so we can help more people with it. And I don't mind if a particular model isn't 100% accurate. I don't expect that from any model. And it's just, I want to find which are the variables that have a greater influence on a phenomenon I am interested in, because I see patients who suffer from things derived from abnormal physiology. So that's how I see it. And that was the focus of my research for the last semester, and will be the focus of my research for this year at least.
Wow. No, that's amazing. So could you sum up one more time in a really simple way? Could you sum up both of those models one more time? And can you tell me what ways are you guys coming up with testing those models? Like, how are you figuring out which one can better explain what's going on there?
Sure. This is a very broad answer, but the lipid energy model, you could say even oversimplify it, states that during carbohydrate restriction, those who are lean will present larger LDL elevations as a result of a higher demand in lipid oxidation. In contrast with people who have a larger peripheral reserve of lipids, they don't have as much strain on lipid oxidation because they have those large reserves. So that's why they present even opposite LDL changes. That's for the lipid energy model and the LMHR phenotype. LMHR being lean mass hyperresponders. Lean people hyper-respond to LDL changes when they restrict carbohydrates. The carbohydrate insulin model and the energy-based model are on a different phenomenon. I mean, dietary related, epidemiologically related, but different phenomena. And they both try to explain why people change their weight, either up or down. Energy-based model says that it is energy deficits or surplus. It doesn't matter so much the chemical nature of the calorie source you are consuming. If in the end there's more energy, your weight will go up. If in the end there's less energy, your weight will go down. And that's why most of those who propose or accept the energy-based model tends to agree with the idea that all calories are equal and that it doesn't matter where they come from, it's their number. The carbohydrate insulin model proposes that weight changes as a result of insulin metabolism, which is stimulated by carbohydrates. But again, not all carbohydrates are equal. So it's not the same. You have, raw strawberries, than a strawberry milkshake. So both are high in carbs, but one has tons of fiber, the other one doesn't. So that's why the carbohydrate insulin model proposes that it is glycemic load, or in other words, a proxy of your physiological response to a load of sugars or carbohydrates. And that as a consequence of that, many different things change in your physiology. One of them, your satiety, although, that's been a heated debate in Twitter these days, but satiety is also very hard to predict and to measure, but also the predisposition of your adipose tissue to store fat. And then as a result, how much fuel there is in your bloodstream after you ate, how quickly that fuel is cleared from your bloodstream, and therefore, how soon and how hungry you feel an hour later, a few hours later. Because then having this, huge spike of insulin and the physiological changes that come with it could make it more likely that you overeat in your next meal. Those are the two phenomena they are trying to understand and how they differ. You could say that the contrast to the lipid energy model in terms for the LDL changes is saturated fat consumption. People who try to explain LDL changes in people following a ketogenic diet, many of them suggest or support the idea that it is their saturated fat consumption what is driving those LDL changes. And how we test them really depends on the data we have. So for the LMHR paper, what we had was the cholesterol survey that Dave Feldman kicked off 2 years ago. And when we had those data, then we were able to analyze that particular hypothesis. But right now we're finishing a meta-analysis looking into that same question. And right now here in my lab, we are carrying what you could say is the experimental confirmation of that particular hypothesis. So we are enrolling people with different BMIs and prescribing a super strict ketogenic diet. And of course, the prediction is that those who are lean will present LDL elevation, and those who are not won't present such elevations. So in the end, the way you test a model really depends on the data you have. Now, to go back to the carbohydrate insulin model, in this particular case, we used the data from a very famous trial in nutrition science, which is the DIET. Perhaps as a short recap, the DIET trial was published in 2018 in JAMA, and it was carried out at Stanford University. It was led by Professor Chris Gardner. And it randomized more than 600 participants with overweight to follow a carbohydrate diet, low carbohydrate diet or low fat diet for 1 year. And an important addition to this is that diet fits researchers made sure that both arms received nutritional education, and that both arms restricted sugar, both arms increased their fiber consumption, both arms had a healthy version of whatever diet they were allocated to. So also as a token of science transparency and reproducibility, they uploaded the data they collected, demographics, lipid panels, dietary data. And those are the data that we were able to use to ask slightly different questions to what were asked in the randomized control trial. Because, for example, the end result, the 12-month time point result for the diet fits trial was that both groups lost a comparable amount of weight. So both low carb and low fat group lost more or less the same amount of weight. And many interpreted these results as all calories are equal. It doesn't matter what type of calories you restrict. If you adhere to the diet, you will lose a comparable amount of weight. However, and I mean, let's not get, only if you want, but it's not necessary to get too technical about it. From a statistical interpretation point of view, this interpretation is not technically correct. However, because we had the data, we were able to run tests about, okay, both arms lost weight, but why? What are the factors that explain weight loss in both groups? And therefore, we were able to inquire a bit more about the mechanisms of weight loss, not necessarily about which diet made people lose more weight, but more about why people lost weight. And we use dietary data, lipid panel data, to understand better the mechanisms that explain weight loss in that particular trial. So again, it really depends on the type of data that you have and how you choose to test a particular model. So far, and I think this is true for perhaps any experiment about any hypothesis, it's very rare when one experiment absolutely convinces everyone of a particular conclusion. It's not. I definitely wouldn't go as far as saying that our analysis absolutely confirmed the carbohydrate insulin model, although of course they support it, or it's way easier to defend the carbohydrate insulin model than the energy-based model based on the results we obtained from our analysis, or that the evidence we have presented so far absolutely confirms the Lipid Energy Model. Because those data and those results are not enough yet, we are still working on producing more data to test if these hypotheses are correct or not. But it is definitely worth highlighting that so far we have tried to go, the extra mile in playing devil's advocate against our own ideas, and we get consistent results from different sources of data and different tests. And it seems to us, with the data we have so far, that no, it's not saturated fat. What's driving LDL changes in people who use carbohydrates is the strain on their lipid metabolism. And no, all calories are not equal. It really depends on the physiological response to carbohydrate intake, what explains better weight loss.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And that's it.
Wow. Well, okay. So this is pure anecdote. I've done this for 16 years now. I've been a personal trainer, I've been a nutrition coach, and I did just anecdote, but I can tell you anecdotally that the more people I tried to put on a low fat, higher carbohydrate diet with lots of grains and lean proteins and lots of fruits and vegetables, in my experience and what I've seen is the entire reason that I practice low carbohydrate nutrition with most of my clients, because I could not get it to work. Maybe it did work and I just saw all of the wrong people, or maybe I'm exaggerating. It wasn't all people that it didn't work for, because you do hear that. You hear that, like, the thing you really should avoid is combination of fat and carbohydrates. Like, you could go very low fat and high carbohydrate and be okay and lose weight. You could do the opposite, go low carbohydrate and be higher fat and also lose weight. You just can't combine the two energy sources. Too much carbohydrate, too much fat, really bad. But in my experience, when I started using low carbohydrate diets, it's almost the reverse, to where I don't find many people that won't work for. So from where I am, I'm not a researcher. I just get paid by people to help give them, advice that should help improve their health. But I can say, again, anecdotally, that's the whole reason I'm here. And that's the whole reason we're having this conversation, because I think low carbohydrate works a lot better for more people. Even if the mechanism isn't exactly perfectly explained, practically speaking, on the ground, it sure seems like somewhere in that world is the truth.
I think that's, the other day, there was this short debate on Twitter, because, oh my God, I don't know at what point in humanity's history we decided that the topics that require more nuance should be discussed in a platform that only allows for 280 characters. That's just crazy, right? This platform allows for very little amounts of text, very limited amounts of other forms of media. Yeah, let's debate here politics and science. Doesn't make any sense, but okay. That's the way it is, and the political and scientific debate in Twitter. That's basically the modern Greeks philosophers match, to go back to philosophy. But the point here was that the low carb community was accused of oversimplifying nutrition by just recommending, oh, you should restrict carbs for everything, And I don't deny that perhaps there are some healthcare workers who just prescribe low carb. But I don't think that's the majority of us. That's certainly not how I practice. The thing is that, exactly as you've said, most of the people I see benefit from low carb. And in most of the patients I see, it works. It's not that I have prescribed Ozempic. I have prescribed aspirin for primary prevention. I have prescribed statins in certain cases. I have nothing against them, other than the perception of how effective they are tends to be overstated. And the old analogy on which is the better tool, if the hammer or the scissors, well, it really depends on what you're trying to do. Are you cutting paper or, hanging a frame in your wall? It's not that low carb is the only thing that works, or that it works for everyone all the time. It's just that for the majority of the metabolic problems we have in the world today, it's, I think, the best starting point for most. This doesn't mean you won't require other forms of metabolic interventions down the road. It's just a good place to start. And along the way, it can solve many other things. I have lost count on the times I've heard, now I sleep better. Now I feel less anxious. Now I have more energy. Now sometimes or the vice versa. I mean, my brother has repeatedly given me permission to tell a little bit about his story, but my brother struggled with anxiety for a while. He was not interested in losing weight, but he was overweight back then. And back then, this was a few years ago, I told him, well, there's some evidence that suggests that a ketogenic diet could help with anxiety. Why don't you try that? And then the positive side effect was that he lost weight. The same thing happens, in the other direction. Some people are trying to lose weight and other things improve, sleep, emotional issues. So it's not that I believe it works for everything, is that in my experience, in what I have observed in my patients and in the research I follow and produce, is a good starting point. This doesn't mean I will never prescribe a statin under any condition, or I will never advise for high carb diets on specific contexts, because it's not like I only prescribe one antibiotic when my patients have an infection, healthcare is all about finding the right intervention for the right context. The thing is that insulin resistance is so prevalent nowadays that the most adequate intervention for the relevant context is very frequently carbohydrate restriction, but that's it.
Yeah. Wow. No, so many great points in what you just said. I think about somebody like Nick Norwitz. Like, he was a lean mass hyperresponder. He chose a ketogenic diet for healing. He needed to heal his gut. His bones were terrible. He found the ketogenic diet. He wasn't seeking weight loss. He needed healing. And to see that his cholesterol numbers went through the roof, his LDL cholesterol went through the roof, is very disconcerting. So asking those questions as far as the lipid energy model, I think, is so important for people that are like that. They have to eat that way or they're going to suffer. And you're right. It's not just weight loss. I was on a podcast recently where the host had recently decided to try a carnivore diet for the first time in her life. And we spent 20 minutes talking about all of the benefits that she had noticed after like 2 or 3 weeks of being carnivore. And after we got off the phone call, she was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot to mention that I lost 5 pounds in 2 weeks. Like, it wasn't on her radar. Like, the other stuff was so important, it trumped all that other stuff. So I think that's a really good point. I'm gonna add something here. I hope this fits the kind of context and maybe helps tell the story, at least for energy balance. Okay. So I worked on metabolic carts. I worked for over a decade measuring people's metabolic rates using metabolic carts. And what we learned, especially early on, is that the people that maybe should have been burning like 2,000 calories at rest, if they started eating 1,500 calories and less than their metabolic rate and started working out on top of that, especially, they would lose weight, but it would be a limited amount of time because their metabolism would compensate. Their metabolic rate would drop. We see that all the time. So we got used to telling people, like, look, you need to eat at least the minimum amount of calories that your body is burning. Okay. So now, as my career is going, I started noticing this other phenomenon where people are starting to do intermittent fasting. Okay. So maybe they're eating 1 meal a day. They're eating lots of animal products. These are also people that should have been burning 2,000 calories. Maybe they were only consuming 1,500 calories like the other people, but the difference was these people weren't hungry. They didn't want to consume more calories as long as they were eating the right things, but their metabolic rates were not low. They were not normal. They were high. And I had to keep seeing that to be like, what is going on? This shouldn't be happening. They're both taking in about the same amount of calories. Maybe they're choosing different meal timing or different ways to get those calories. Why is the delta between these two people 1,000 calories? How can the faster be burning 1,000 calories more than the dieter? Really interesting.
I think that, look, what makes these results hard to reconcile sometimes is that people forget that one of the main ways of restricting carbohydrates is restricting your calories, and vice versa. If you restrict carbohydrates, it's likely you will restrict caloric intake. If you restrict caloric intake, it's likely you will restrict carbohydrate intake. Because of the way that it is, formulated in most Western countries. They go together. So on one hand, that makes both hard to separate or to dissect the effects of both interventions. Of course, if you fast, you are likely reducing calorie intake and carbohydrate intake. And of course, if you only consume highly satiating foods, you will likely restrict carbohydrates later or calories later of any sort. So it's, again, they go together most of the times. And this is what makes sometimes hard to tell what is driving the wheel, if it's calories or something else. You just reminded me of a short and crazy experiment I subjected myself into, and some of my best friends 6 or 7 years ago. That was perhaps one of my first explorations into carbohydrates and insulin versus calories in, calories out. To make a long story short, what we tried to do was that, because, okay, let me draw a small parenthesis here. The calories in, calories out model tends to focus on the calories in part of the equation, because it's super hard to measure your calories out. I mean, it kind of perceives calories out as this fixed number that will stay there, and we will just focus on your calories in to make you lose weight. But the calories out component is super, super hard to measure and not stable at all, as you just pointed out. I mean, it's you really shouldn't assume it's fixed, and you really shouldn't assume is constant. At the same time, you just cannot go to work inside a metabolic chamber, at least not for most people. So we tried to test a real world setting calories in, calories out model by first of all having a better than usual idea about our energy expenditure. So back then, Fitbits started becoming a thing. And I actually wrote to Fitbits to learn if they could share with me the equation they used to estimate calorie expenditure with your heart rate. And they denied. But then we were able to reverse engineer that model. And we found the paper where they got that particular formula. And then we tested if the heart rate monitor was actually accurate against the halter. And we did, to the best of our capabilities, we obtained for 1 month our average energy expenditure. And then what we did, once we had that number, we designed a diet that would adhere to all the recommendations for a healthy diet. 50% carbs, 30% protein, 20% fats, very low in saturated fat, very low in sodium, all the regular stuff. But we used foods with reported insulin indexes. We ate the exact same thing for a month. Every day, the same breakfast, the same lunch, the same dinner for 1 month. And then measured weight. And then what we did was that we had 1 month for washout. And then another month, the exact same foods, but rearranged. So all the high insulinogenic foods were once a day on the same meal, and all the low insulinogenic foods on the other meal with 16 hours of fasting in between. So we were absolutely sure it was the same amount of calories because it was the same food every day. And we were absolutely sure they were the same quality of calories because it was the same food every day. And yeah, not surprisingly, in 1 month, we lost weight with intermittent fasting, and the other one, our weight went slightly up. But what you remind me now is that the day we started, I was very worried because I couldn't believe that was the amount of food I needed. I was sure I made some error in calculating the diets, because it was, I remember very clearly, it was like 5 p.m. and I couldn't stand the idea of eating what was left in my daily meals bag. And I was sure, I fucked it up. I surely calculated wrong something. And my friends were telling me the same, like, this is just too much food. I won't be able to finish. And I was like, okay, I will triple check every number. Also because I am slightly dyslexic. And I will triple check everything. Just bear with me. I triple checked every diet and all of them were correctly calculated. And I was like, okay, it looks like this is it. Try to finish it the best you can. Okay. 3 days after, all of us were hungry. And we stayed hungry for 1 month. So it was, then I learned that, this is something that you could very easily miss because you don't eat the exact same thing every day, But the same amount and the same types of food that made me feel super fed up 72 hours before, now were leaving me hungry. And satiety is such a weird thing and such a hard thing to infer and to predict. Because, I experienced that for 2 months. The same amount of food that made me feel super full on the first month, that amount of that sensation lasted for 48 hours. I spent hungry the rest of the month. And in the month with intermittent fasting, I wasn't hungry at all.
Wow.
Because I was having one huge spike of insulin every day. And then I was finishing my day with no insulin spikes and then with 16 hours of fasting. But I wasn't hungry that month. So it's really, to me, that convinced me of it's really not the amount of food.
Yeah.
And what drives my willingness to eat more is definitely what happens in my physiology when I rearrange insulin spikes,
Wow. Yeah, that's a great observation. And again, from what I see with my clients, they would report the exact same thing in a much less scientific way, but they would anecdotally say the exact same thing. Look, man, we're talking about calories in, calories out. We're talking about saturated fat. We're talking about LDL cholesterol. These are sacred cows, right? Like these are ideas that people put their entire careers on, and the implications of your work are so great. We almost don't even know like what questions we could continue asking in the future because the paradigm would completely shift. Everything would change if some of the things you're studying turn out to be right, and it sure seems like every day there's more and more evidence to support the things that we've been talking about today. So on that note, what kind of pushback have you gotten? What kind of what kind of criticism have you gotten? Because I don't think you can do this kind of work and not get some type of criticism for it.
Sure. I think that it's understandable and expected that those who, like I did, learned in a particular way how physiology works, they will, it's always annoying to have to learn again. Now, I by no means I'm trying to imply that they are lazy or whatever, or it's just that I think that our default state is always skepticism, and that's okay. I think that's fantastic. I have the same attitudes towards pretty much everything. It's perfectly understandable and expected that people show skepticism the first time they encounter an idea, and they push back with the arguments they know about. But hey, how do you explain then this study? How do you explain this anecdote? How do you explain this, tangential concept. How do you? That's okay. That's as long as everyone is able to change their mind. There's this meme I love when I teach statistics about Han Solo, about how Han Solo is a perfect skeptic, because he starts not believing in the Force, but when he sees unquestionable empirical evidence, he changes his mind. So that's the way it should be. You know, it's of course it's harder to change your mind if you have any form of vested interest, not necessarily a financial one. It's not that, oh, everyone is trying to make more money. And I mean, the world is not as simple as that. Sometimes that vested interest is perhaps some of your identity is vested into that. You know, hey, I am the doctor who prescribes A, B, and C, and that will make it harder at a personal level. That's okay. I do believe that all of us should be skeptics to any new idea. I'm not convinced carbohydrate restriction is a new idea, and I am not convinced. Actually, for example, if you go, yeah, this is ancient history, but Wilbur Otto Atwater was the one who made the conversion factors from grams to calories. 4 for carbohydrates, 9 for fats, 7 for alcohol. One of his colleagues back then, Max, he's the guy. I mean, Max Bruckner did it for animals, for dogs. He did some experiments with dogs, which wouldn't be allowed by any ethics committee today. But he experimented with dogs, and Atwater experimented with humans. And if you go back to the history of how those experiments were designed and were interpreted, and I mean, you would find lots of troubles. And none of those experiments would pass modern peer review. But very interestingly, if you read Max Bruckner's text, at the very last chapter, he says that, I mean, despite having dedicated years and years and years of his life to estimating the energy contributions of macronutrients, he said that it was unlikely that the energy contributions could explain most of the metabolic problems they observed, and that it was most likely the chemical properties of those foods what affected those results. You know, I mean, not even the father of energy balance believed energy balance explained metabolic problems. And he used, I mean, a different language because, of course, back then they didn't have around concepts like, I mean, hormones existed, but not exactly the way we see them today, etc., etc., etc. So pushback is inevitable. Pushback. Some people have pointed out that, hey, that data is from self-reported, self-selected patients. Hey, this is not a randomized controlled trial. Hey, this is not, this is in contrast, or this is at odds with, for example, I don't know, other study, whatever. That's okay. I mean, and that's why we still try to produce new arguments. I don't have a problem with changing my mind about what causes obesity or what causes LDL changes, because I have changed my mind already. You know, I left med school believing it was saturated fat and energy balance. I honestly don't have a problem in changing my mind again. I already did it. And yes, some of those points have pushed our arguments forward and have, I mean, some of those points also were self-identified, you know. I mean, this is imperfect data, and that's the part where you acknowledge the limitations in the study. Other points have made us, okay, perhaps an experiment that looks like this could counter-argue this point. And in the end, that's the way science progresses. I don't expect to convince everyone with a single experiment. You know? That's, at the same time, you could always argue that not everyone is convinced by facts, and that if that were the case, we wouldn't have many of the debates we have on Twitter. So there has been some pushback, but at the same time, I haven't seen an argument that makes me change my mind again.
Yeah. And again, every time we talk, there seems to be more evidence. There's always more evidence. And you're in such a unique place where you're working with people in clinic. You're also studying the data and conducting the research and analyzing the research. And so you, of all people, would know. And to have somebody in that position who is willing to change their mind, I think is just so absolutely wonderful and so helpful for pushing this message forward. So I really appreciate you and everything that you've done, Dr. Soto-Mota. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you in your work?
Twitter is a good place at Adrian Soto-Mota, Sotomota. And yeah, email is adrian.soto@tec.mx. And yeah, happy to continue learning about metabolism and to talk about it anytime. Thanks again for having me.
That's awesome. It's such an honor to have you, dude. I knew this conversation was going to be great, whatever direction it went in. And I love learning from you, and I love the work that you're doing. I get so excited to see that what I'm seeing with my people on the ground, what I'm experiencing myself, is not only something that you're seeing anecdotally, but something that you are seeking to prove and to show the data so that we can satisfy some of these questions once and for all, because we are in a very, very bad metabolic mess right now. And people are very, very sick and they are suffering. And we need to find better solutions, because clearly, like what we've tried, it doesn't look like it's working. So Dr. Adrian Soto-Mota, thank you so very much for everything you do. And thank you for taking time out of your very busy life to come chat with us today. We really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.